Working for a mission-driven organization is one way to make an impact in my community, but what are other ways? And once people figure out what those other ways are, there comes this freedom of like, oh, I don't necessarily have to work in nonprofit. I am safe to make more money and to continue making an impact in a different way.
Hello, hello, and welcome back to the Ambitious Women of Color podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Lynn Rojas. Today, we're talking about something that doesn't get enough attention: the systemic ways women of color are undervalued and underpaid in the workplace, especially in mission driven spaces like nonprofits that recruit us with values we care about and then exploit our passions. My guest is Carla Santamaria. She is a career strategist and host of the First Gen Coach podcast. As a first gen professional herself, she's more than doubled her salary in 10 months by pivoting industries, and now she helps other women of color do the same. We're talking about how to recognize where you're being underpaid, how to take control of your career, and how to do good in the world without sacrificing yourself in the process. This is a real talk that you need to hear. Let's get into it. Hello, hello. And hi, Carla. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm really excited to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Jess. Thanks so much. I am so happy to be here.
Let's start with our signature question. What is one thing you refuse to sacrifice for your career?
I love this question. A few things come to mind. For example, I refuse to sacrifice my physical or mental health for my career. But what I think is the number one thing that I refuse to sacrifice for my career is my integrity. Very early in my career, I had an experience where I was asked to do something that I found dishonest. And I said no, that I wouldn't do it. And I was fired. I was exited, it's what they called it. But essentially, it was me getting fired from that role because I refused to do something that was dishonest. And while I'm not necessarily glad that it happened, if it had to happen, I'm glad that it happened early in my career because I knew from the very beginning that I would not sacrifice my integrity for career growth.
I love that you're bringing that to light because I feel like there's so many of us that grow up with you have to be a good worker, you have to be that good girl, right? Don't push back, don't like question things, just go ahead and do what you're told. So a lot of times you will face that in your career, in your jobs where you're asked to do something that maybe it's like as crazy as like illegal, or maybe it's just something that doesn't sit well with your values. And that's where you need to choose. Like, is this something worth me continuing if it's going against my values? And if that means, getting exited, is that a risk you're willing to take? But in the sense like that you come to terms with what is important to you, and that can be a turning point for you. So I'm really glad that you're bringing awareness to that, because it's so important to know that, like, yes, if you stand up for what you believe, they could be those repercussions, but in hindsight, that is going to be probably the best thing that happened to you, so that you're not, in that environment that is making you do things that go against your values.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd love to hear about your story. Like, I know you've been involved in DEI work, career coaching, and I would like to know, like, what are some of the systemic issues that you've seen that women of color face in the workplace?
Whew, okay. Which ones don't we face? So the workplace exists at the intersection of multiple systems of oppression. I mean, first and foremost, capitalism is, again, like capitalism is designed to extract the labor and the value that the workers create and provide. And that is extracted by, the handful of billionaires at the very top. So that's already a system of oppression. But then there's also racism. I mean, we don't need to go into the history of racism
Hmm.
in the United States and around the world. There is a reason why there have been like so much need for example, like civil rights movements, because the workplace and really like this entire country was built on racism, and that is entrenched into the workplace. There is also sexism and ableism and misogyny and so many things that intersect at the workplace that harm women and people of color and people whose identities have been marginalized. I mean, we can look at the intersectional pay gap, for example. Latina has to work in 2025, had to work all the way up until mid-October in order to earn the equivalent of what a white non-Hispanic man was earning. But if we break it down, it's like that is a Latina woman who does not have children. There's also like the mother the mom's pay gap, and then there's also trans women's pay gap. It's just all exists because the workplace exists at intersecting systems of oppression. And my approach is bringing light to the systems and making these systems visible so that as much as possible, we can protect ourselves from these harmful systems because we have to navigate the workplace. We exist in
Mhm.
capitalism. Like I am not independently wealthy, so I have to have a job to support myself. And I am aware of how all these systems impact me and people who are non-native English speakers, for example, or who do not have US citizenship and are trying to work in the US. Like there's so many different barriers that are really representative of these systemic things that, by the way, were built on purpose. So
Mhm.
it's not by accident that the wage gap exists. That exists because of misogyny and sexism. It is not by accident that the intersectional pay gap that is, race based exists because that exists because of racism. I mean, even if we think about the concept of minimum wage, and as of this recording, the federal minimum wage in the United States has not risen in over 16 years. And the concept of minimum wage is established because if not, companies would pay you less. Like companies literally
Mhm.
want to pay you as little as possible, that we need a government regulation to say how much, like how much is the bare minimum.
Yeah.
So again, all of these systems intersect at the workplace.
Yeah, that is a lot. A lot of systems, like you said, racism and the pay gap, and that's something that we face. It's crazy how we have to navigate all of these things, and it's literally jumping through hoops to be able to grow in our career, be able to do it in a way that is aligned with our values, be able to get compensated what we deserve, and it's just a lot for women, especially women of color, to have to face. And I know we talked about this before too, but how so many women of color are drawn to nonprofits and mission driven organizations because they're aligned with our values. So we think finally a place that, I could do meaningful work and be valued. But sometimes these are the places that actually are contributing to the undervalue and underpaying of women of color. I'd love to learn your take on that.
Yes. So I remember the exact moment that I fell out of love with nonprofit work. So, for a little bit of background, I spent the first 10 years of my career at the intersection of nonprofits. So I worked for a college access nonprofit. So, that's why I was saying at the intersection of nonprofit, college access, and then eventually college access, college success. And I work with a lot of community partners, most of which were nonprofit. I remember the exact moment I fell out of love with nonprofit work because I was in graduate school and I was getting ready to apply for jobs. And I saw a job for a program manager for one of the largest nonprofits in Miami. And I looked at the pay, and this was, I want to say, in maybe 2018. And the pay for a program manager for a job on site in downtown Miami was $50,000. And the poverty line, like not necessarily like the poverty line, but like I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but it is the wage at which you are able to receive federal assistance. It was something like $51,000. So I realized that the compensation for that for that job in that nonprofit would make me eligible for the nonprofit's services. And
Hmm.
I thought, oh no, no, there's something wrong here. So it was at that moment that I just like, nope, nonprofit work actually perpetuates the economic inequality that it is like supposedly trying to close. And that was me and like my experience with falling out of nonprofit. But it's this realization of if your nonprofit salary would make you eligible for their services, then they're just perpetuating economic inequality. And as you mentioned, this primarily and predominantly impacts women of color because women of color are socialized into low paying nonprofit jobs. Women of
Hmm.
color are told from the time that we are young that we need to give back to our community, that we need to nurture, that we need to make a difference. Don't worry about the money. And so, like, what does that mean? That we're socialized out of these like STEM classes, or even if it's not socialized, like a friend of mine, she started her college career as an engineer. And she
Mhm.
was one of like she was the only woman of like 400 students. She eventually left because it was so toxic. And so that's what I mean by like socialization. Like there's different
Mhm.
factors. And even before we get there, like the college advisors, the high school advisors are telling men to go into finance and are telling women to become a teacher or to become a nurse or to become a social worker or to start a nonprofit. And not that these jobs are not valuable, they are so
Mhm.
impactful and they make such an impact into the lives of the communities, but they heavily rely on the unpaid labor of women of color. And if we think about the history of nonprofit work, the nonprofit industrial complex was originally founded of charity work from
Mhm.
the late 1800s, when like Rockefeller and Carnegie were all like exploiting workers and making
Yeah.
all their money, what it was capitalism and this oppressive system. And so, as a way to sort of put a band aid on all the harm that they were causing, they started all these foundations and all these all these charity work. And again, the people that were doing it with like the rich white ladies, whose husbands were financing their entire lives. And so they didn't necessarily need a job. Like this charity work
Yeah.
was unpaid. And because it was originally unpaid and performed by people who had a different way of sustaining themselves,
Mhm.
when it eventually transformed into nonprofit work, it continued to be very low paid. But now it's not the wives of rich people who are working at these nonprofit jobs. I mean, sometimes it is, but predominantly it's women of color who do not have generational wealth and who are then socialized into a system that perpetuates economic inequality.
Yes, especially like when you said that if the services that these nonprofits provide, if you qualify for them with these salaries, that's like really eye-opening. I mean, my first experience working in nonprofit was I did City Years, an AmeriCorps program, and I essentially was getting paid below poverty level in Washington, D.C. This is, great. Like it's a gap year that you're doing and you feel so excited. It was like after college, feel so excited that you're contributing and giving back. So I'm working in a high school in DC. It is very underserved. Then the teachers are all Teach for America. So you have the Teach for America teachers and the city year, mentors in the schools. We're all like getting paid below poverty level. I had to get on food stamps because you qualified for that because I was literally getting paid below poverty level. Like it wasn't enough. It was barely enough for me to pay like my room with roommates that I had. And we would just like have to figure out how we make our money last for the month.
Right. And so here's it. So I did AmeriCorps for 2 years, actually. So first I did a national program, I mean, a state program, and then I did the
Hmm.
VISTA program. And the VISTA stands
Okay.
for like volunteer and service to America. So I made even less than in the national program working in Miami. And now I will say with my year of service, I had a positive experience, but I say like I had a positive experience within a broken system.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, right. So like I had a positive experience because I was working, living at home. My dad was like, why'd you graduate from college to become a volunteer? Like he was just so confused, because I was making like my biweekly paycheck was in like 2016 was $469. Like all of that was going to like gas and tolls and like feeding myself. So I didn't even have to like cover rent. And yet one of the other vistas in my office was this rich girl from Connecticut who was living in a high rise that her parents paid for. And again, like my parent, I
Hmm.
live with my dad, so no shame there. But the way again, like the Vista program
Hmm.
allows essentially like the children of the 1% to cosplay poverty versus those of us who come from these communities and who are drawn to this work because we see ourselves in the community that we serve. It is just perpetuating poverty for us. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Teach for America because my other gripe with Teach for America is that the communities and the students that Teach for America teaches,
Hmm.
those students have the highest need. So why would they get the most inexperienced teachers? Like that is so
Yeah.
harmful. Do you see how from the very beginning like students of color, students from marginalized backgrounds are not being set up for success. I remember I used to know this woman who was a Teach for America teacher. right around when I was a Vista member, and she was saying like that she was doing her student teaching and she finally like learned this new tactic and she goes, "Yeah,
Mhm.
and then I felt so bad because I had actually misunderstood this, so I ended up teaching the students. I taught them the wrong thing really well." And I was
Oh,
just thinking
wow.
like you are actively causing harm to these students. So again, these programs were not designed by people who are in these communities. And there is a lot of well meaning people like you and me that participated in the program, and we may even have had a positive experience.
Yeah,
But
I
when we
did,
think
but,
about,
looking back, you're just like, because then I continue nonprofit work, and again, the nonprofits that I worked in, great causes, so I will say at least the ones that I was involved in, great causes, but one of the reasons that I left was because of the pay, was because, like, the last one I was making I think $37,000. And this is like years after college in the Bay Area, which, if you know anything about the Bay Area in California, it's one of the most expensive places. So I actually was in the process of applying for grad school during this time that I was like, okay, I need to make a change because I need to save up for grad school because I'm not going to be working while I'm in grad school. So I'm not going to be able to afford my life and I can't save anything with what I'm making now. So then I knew I was going into a master's of public health and healthcare management. So I got a job at like a big consulting firm in San Francisco and I started working as an executive assistant because I was like I one would get paid more and two then I get my foot in the door in consulting and start learning from the people that are doing this work. I went in as an EA and I was working with 2 managing partners, but, like, now I'm making 55,000 versus the 37. So it was like, "Okay." And for a moment, I had that internal guilt of, like, you're leaving the mission driven and because even till now I'm still mission driven, but now I'm smart about it because you got to pay me. But
right.
I
Mhm.
felt that guilt internally, like you're leaving, doing good in the world to work for companies that are like working for other big companies and making them a lot of money. So
Yes.
I did
Well,
have that internal struggle.
100%. I had that internal struggle too when I I think I had that internal struggle and I stayed in nonprofit and then I was in higher education and I made slightly more. Mostly because I was moving up. Now that I'm thinking about it,
Mhm,
like I
mhm,
made slightly more because I had more education and was at a higher
mhm.
position, not necessarily because the pay was better. But I had that struggle too. And it would take me years. It would take me years actually. It was smack in the middle of the pandemic when my partner and I were trying to buy a house. And I was trying to like do my budget and figure out like, well, with my student loans, I can only pay this much towards the mortgage. And so then I thought, well, if I start in an income driven repayment plan, then I can lower my student loan payment and increase my mortgage payment. And then I thought, wait, hold on, income driven repayment plan? Am I committing to staying in a low paying job? No, no. I just need to make more money. And so having that realization that even the fact that like an income driven repayment plan would mean I would have to like stay low income, I was just like, absolutely not. And so by then I was able to like, I transferred into healthcare, was there for less than a year. And then I transitioned again into the corporate world. And I was able to do that guilt free because I learned to recognize that there are so many more ways to impact our community than to dedicate my career to a nonprofit job.
No, I love that you mentioned that because, like, I got my master's of public health and I focus, to be honest, I was going in at first for community health. But then after, like all the work I've done in nonprofit and at the time too, I was working in public health and I'm like, I'm going to be poor forever. And I mean, I've always lived in big cities that DC, Boston, San Francisco, Bay Area, like big cities that 55,000 doesn't take you very far. I was like, that's what like after grad school, I was working at the VA healthcare system in Boston while I was in grad school. And then when I finished, if I was going to get a job there, it would have been like 57,000. And I'm like, no, I didn't. spend $100,000 on my education so that I can go back and make $57,000. But
Same.
that's why I focus on healthcare management because I was like, okay, you know what? Like, I'm still, again, my mission driven brain, I'm still doing well in the world. I am, working in something I'm passionate about. I love like healthcare and, okay, I don't love healthcare. I love the being able to shape it and make a difference and, work in being able to improve it. but
Yes. No, I totally.
but but I went in more strategically this time. I'm like, I'm gonna go in learning the business of healthcare and understanding like all the process improvement and how to, implement strategic planning and strategies to improve things. And I mean, that's what I do now and that's what I've been doing in my career. And I really do love what I do, but I also get paid really well.
Yes, and that is what it is. It's like aligning how can you make a living, make a life, and also contribute to community the way that you want to. I had a similar thought actually. I was still in undergrad at the time. I thought maybe I wanted to be a teacher. And I remember saying out loud the words, well, I'm gonna be a teacher, so I'm gonna be poor for the rest of my life. And one of my friends who was there, she was white, and she was like, well, it's not necessarily true. You can invest. And I just like I mean, I didn't have the financial literacy at the time, but I
Mhm.
remember thinking, I'm gonna be poor for the rest of my life. Like that, like that similar thought. And also in grad school. So in grad school, I had a couple of different scholarships. So my degree, I think I graduated with like 35K of student debt because the other 70K was covered by
Well,
multiple
that's nice.
scholarships. But I remember also in grad school, there was this is what the moment that I fell out of love with higher education. So one of the program directors sent the job to the listserv, and the job was for a community organizer, and the job paid $35,000 a year in Miami. Took that personally. I was so personally offended. I was just like, how dare you send this to your students? How dare you send this to me? This degree costs $72,000 and you want me to apply for a job that pays $35,000 a year? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And, again, that was the moment that I realized I was like, oh, there's something truly wrong here, truly wrong in how we're educating students. And my cohort, guess what? My program was in community psychology, was mostly women of color. We had, I think, one man, maybe two white women in the program. It was a small program, but it was mostly women of color. And so, just all these, it runs deep is what I want to say.
Yeah.
But similar to you, I just do want to reiterate that there are so many ways to impact our community. And these are one of the things that I would talk about. Corporate America is
Mhm.
by no means perfect. I know I've been hating on nonprofit for a little bit. Corporate America is also like,
It can
you
have
know,
it can have its own episode.
exactly. Really? It's yeah, it is toxic in a different way, but at least you are getting paid a lot more money than in nonprofit and you have the opportunity to leverage your higher wages to improve the quality of your life and you can decide if you want to contribute to causes that you care about, if you want to hire a housekeeper with, or if you want to hire other ways you're contributing to your community by just like the power that you're like earning more than you would be if you were like working 50, 60 hours a week at a nonprofit job making barely above the poverty line.
Yeah, there are so many ways that you contribute and when you're making more money, then invest in either programs or organizations that are doing the good work, right? And then you can also donate to charity, but also do your research because there's so many times that you could be donating to charity and you feel like you're doing something great. But I mean, from us working in a nonprofit and understanding how a lot of that works, like it might not be going directly to what you think it's going to. So, but definitely there are so many other ways. And that's like one of the reasons too why it's like I want to be rich because I get to do what I want and more money in the hands of good people. We get to design and do the things that we want our way without like those red tapes or limitations or all of these other systemic and institutional barriers to be able to actually do something equitable and directly helping the people that need it.
Yes, 100%. So it's been proven, and I don't have the data source right in front of me, but over 10 years ago, I was already aware of the fact that when NGOs, so like a non-governmental organization,
Mhm,
when they go into like other countries that were formerly colonized and are therefore, have been exploited and are have had their resources tapped. Sometimes people call them the third world, but it's like, well, we're underdeveloped. And I'm like, well, actually, we're just formerly colonized and exploited. Going into these communities where there's a lot of economic stability, again, because of the exploitation, but these NGOs, when they create like micro grants for women, when they invest in women, women uplift not just themselves, but also their family and their
mhm,
communities. So, like, literally, it has been proven that women do good things with money. Women of color do good things in money. That's one of the things that I am truly most proud of my coaching business is that I think about how I've helped my community get over $600,000 in salary increases. I'm like, that is $600,000 into our community. That is $600,000 that they are paying it forward, that they are getting out of debt, that they are helping to retire their parents. Like it is just expanding and it is our responsibility. I really believe that it is our responsibility
yeah.
to become financially free because we can bring others with us.
Yeah, and I love that you touched on that because like you helping these women, like even if it's several $1,000s of increase from their last job, that is going to make an impact and it's going to help them, with their family and helping their family and just also just breaking that cycle of um thinking that you have to under earn and advocating for yourself and they're going to take those lessons and those skills to the next job and then negotiate their raise, negotiate if you get laid off. Like there is so much power in realizing the value that you bring and really advocating for yourself for that.
Absolutely.
And I like to, shift a little bit more of like what are some things that women of color can do to take control of this situation to like navigate the systems that are already out there. Like what are some ways, whether it could be some like red flags that they can look for when they're job searching or if they're already in a role, what are some things that they can do to either determine if they want to stay there or not or make a plan to move to somewhere that is going to be paying them what they deserve.
Yes. So the first thing that you need to understand is that in careers, so in most medium to large companies, there's a thing called job levels. So, in the nonprofit world, there's coordinator, manager, senior manager, director.
Mhm,
In the private sector, that's usually like a specialist, senior specialist, or sometimes they use a third associate. So all of those things are called job levels and they correlate to a level of responsibility and pay. Obviously, a
mhm,
coordinator is going to have less responsibility and less knowledge or an experience, and so
mhm,
therefore less pay. A director is going to be banking on multiple years of experience and education and therefore is going to have a higher salary. The problem with this structure is that women of color tend to be under leveled. So this has happened to me at one of my jobs was actually like my job title was manager, but I was doing the work of a director.
mhm.
And same thing, and like I've had other women of color tell me, Carla, when I left that job, they hired two people to replace me. So the first thing that I would encourage every single person listening to this to do is to get their job description. First,
Mhm,
get their job description. That's the second thing. First thing is just start listing out everything that they do. Like just list out every single thing that they do. Do you manage budgets? Do you manage students? How many students? How many community partners? Are you doing presentations? Are you tabling? What impact are you having? So just start writing all of that down. And then get your job description and compare it. Does your job description say that you manage like one student, but you're actually managing five students? Or does it
Mhm.
say that you're managing 2 programs, but you're actually managing 4 programs? But, it's like, or does your nonprofit say that you're coordinating, like college access for 50 students, but you're actually doing 100 students? Like, first of all, check, like, recognize if there's a discrepancy between the job that you're doing and your job description. Um, at this point, you have
Mhm.
options. So, I would say actually before you have options, let's do a little bit more research. That's the first thing. The next thing is do some research. So look at the job title that you have. So if your job title is manager, let's say in, like a nonprofit manager, look up other nonprofit job managers and see what their responsibilities are
Mhm.
and what their compensation is. And in a city close to you, obviously, because location, is one of the factors that determine pay.
Yeah.
So do that for your title, do that for how much education and experience you have, and do that for the actual responsibilities, because that's when you're going to start seeing what I actually do is the job of a director. And they're over here
And you're not
calling
getting
me
paid
manager.
for it.
Exactly. Exactly. So that is one way that, like, we can arm ourselves with knowledge, just like really starting to see it's like, wait, hold on. I'm doing these jobs that require like 7 years of experience, but the job that I'm hired for only requires like 2 years of experience. So I would say arm yourself with that research. So this is like the things that you're comparing are the actual job title, the level of education and skills required, and the actual responsibilities, because then you're going to be seen if you are underleveled. And if you're underleveled, this is when you have choices. You can
Mhm.
either negotiate for a promotion or you can get a new job. So
Yeah.
that is, yeah, but you really, like, really have to understand this is one of the things that I did when I went from higher education to healthcare to tech and, more than doubled my salary in a 10-month period because I suspected that I was underpaid, but I didn't have the knowledge, the skills, the language to do
Mhm.
it, to prove it, excuse me.
Yeah.
And so I started doing this research. And in my second job, in my healthcare job, I started doing that research and I saw that somebody with my skills and my level of experience would should be making between like 85 and 95K, and I was making 65K. And so I
Yeah.
ended up taking that to my boss, who laughed at me. By the way, she was like, "Oh, that's not going to happen." And I was like, "All right, lady." A few
Peace.
months later, I left that job. But yeah, that is the main thing. Just like anybody who is listening, really start understanding like how much you're doing, like how much work you're doing, how much impact you're having on the team. And then does that match with the scope of your role that you were originally hired to do? And if not, can you negotiate for a promotion or do you want to leave?
Yeah, those are like some great steps. And I mean, just doing that exercise alone, you're going to see the value because I feel like, again, especially for women of color, sometimes we don't realize all the work and value that you are bringing to this role. So, right there, you can see whether or not you're doing the role of someone above you. You can see, like, okay, now I have it written down. And when I'm working on my resume, when I'm working on applications for other jobs, I know exactly what I've been doing. So it's definitely already has, like you said, that evidence and it gives you that leverage of when you are going to negotiate your salary. You're like, hey, here's everything I'm doing. Here's everything in my job description. If they don't give you what is, what you deserve for what the work that you're doing, then that's where you need to make the decision. Like, is it worth me staying? But if you really want to take control of your career growth, of your salary and your potential, salary growth, then you definitely should go somewhere that they're going to be valued because then you're just going to continue being taken advantage of.
Absolutely. You reminded me of something. I don't know if I've ever really realized it because for my healthcare job, I wasn't asking for 85 to 95. I was literally just asking for 5K. I wanted to get from 5K to 60K. But what you just made me realize right now is that in my healthcare job, when I found that I was underpaid, I was also just asking for 5.
And in the grand scheme, in a
Yes.
12-month period, that's chunk change.
Right. Yes. But again, like I didn't necessarily know. And I just knew, like, based on that data, I was like, I should have been paid 10% more. And because I was making
Mhm.
51K, like
Mhm.
it was, you know, 5K. So had either one of those 2 workplaces actually met my request to pay me 5K more, I wouldn't have doubled my salary by the end of that year, you know? And here's the thing, like, it was so hard to especially, like, my higher education job, I loved that job. So, once I realized the discrepancy in my pay, I had to grieve that. I remember driving to the office
Mhm,
and just sobbing because this was during the pandemic, so I was working from home, but I had to
mhm.
drive to the office to pick up some things, and I knew deep down in my heart that I wasn't gonna go back to that job. So I knew that that was the last time that I was gonna go back into that office, and I was sobbing, and I realized that I truly loved that job, but I couldn't stay. Loved that job, but I had to love myself more, and so I left.
My god. Like, that's exactly it, where it's like, no matter how much you loved what you were doing, if it's not really providing what you need financially and for you to be able to grow and for you to be able to, be in a good financial situation, then it's self-abandonment if you stayed. So, I love that you chose yourself and that you betted on yourself. It sounds like you're really happy in where you are. I mean, you now have a coaching business as well, so it was exactly what you needed to do, and I'm glad that worked out for you. But it's like also a testament to others that when you do choose you first, everything else will fall into place and you will find your path and you can still do great work, and whether it's at your 9 to 5, whether you start your own business, because that has allowed us to be able to give so much and literally change people's lives. So
Yes.
there is still ways that you can be able to do good in the world and make your mark. And it doesn't mean that you need to sacrifice yourself in order to do that.
Absolutely. And, I also just want to add one more thing because when I worked in higher
Yeah.
education, I had this idea of this like, because I was working as like, again, like at the intersection of civic engagement. And I was working with like 50 nonprofit partners and students. And I knew that I had such a far reaching impact. And then when I worked in healthcare, the healthcare system that I worked saw 165,000 patients a year. It seems like I think I heard a stat that like 3 out of every 4 babies born in that county were born in one of their hospitals.
Oh,
So it was massive. So I had this like super big idea of like my role and the impact. And then I got to thinking, well, what if my impact can just be mentoring one person? What if my impact can just be creating more equitable workspaces in my one team? What if my impact can be focused on my immediate surroundings and not on trying to save the world? And that impact can create a ripple effect. And that's what allowed me to have the capacity to not be so worried about money where like I could start my coaching business,
hmm
and that's just another thing. Like with these mission driven organizations, it is so easy to and like tempting and alluring to want to be aligned with this like broad mission. And I agree. And I listen, I have a podcast that does not make me any money. Okay. Like I I'm with you on like, you know, this, but I will say, like, I want to encourage listeners not necessarily to abandon mission driven organizations, but to rethink their role in missions. Like maybe, like I work in human resources now. And maybe the person, or maybe somebody's working in sales or working, in accounting and at like a private company. Maybe it's not necessarily a private company that is, like the world's best mission, but as long as it's aligned with your values and you know that you can impact those around you, you know that when you're not so stressed about money, you can be kinder to your family. You know that when you're not so stressed about money, you can, if you want, volunteer politically, then that's your mission too. And so I just really want to encourage you, all your listeners and everyone who's, just thinking about this to think about like, okay, working for a mission driven organization is one way to make an impact in my community, but what are other ways? And once people figure out what those other ways are, there comes this freedom of like, oh, I don't necessarily have to work in nonprofit. I am safe to make more money and to continue making an impact in a different way.
wow. I love ending exactly on this note because there is so many other ways that you can still make an impact and it doesn't mean that you have to self-sacrifice. So thank you so much. And how can they connect with you? How can they work with you? Let us know.
Yes. So wherever everyone is listening to this podcast, you can find my podcast, The First Gen Coach, a career development podcast for Latinas and first gen professionals. If you type into the search bar Latina career development, I should be the second search result. I'm working on becoming the first. So we'll see. Hopefully by the time this airs, I'll be the first. So yeah, you can just find me, The First Gen Coach podcast. You can also find me on Instagram at Carla, the First Gen Coach. You can find me on LinkedIn, Carla Santamaria, the First Gen Coach, and say hi. Let me know that you found me through this podcast. I work with people one-on-one in 6-month coaching. I also do speaking engagements. I do workshops for employers, for ERGs, for nonprofit organizations that are focused on economic development. Like there's just so many ways to get involved. So if somebody wants to work with me one-on-one or hire me for their company or organization, I am super excited to chat.
Well, thank you again so much, Carla, for all of your knowledge and expertise and all the value and, great tips that all these women are going to take from this episode. So thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. I hope you got exactly what you needed from this episode and that at least one thing clicked. One shift, one conversation, one thing you could actually try this week. And if you're listening and thinking, okay, but how do I apply this to my job, my boss, my situation? That's where I come in. I work one-on-one with ambitious women of color who want to grow in their career, get promoted, negotiate more money, or make the next move without burning themselves out or losing their peace. We get clear on the strategy, work through what's really getting in the way, and build the success that actually fits your life. If this episode resonated and you want support, you can find me at jessicalynn-wellness.com or DM me on Instagram at jessicalynn-wellness. We'll chat about how I can help you thrive in your career and in your whole life. And if you know another ambitious woman of color who needs the conversation, share this episode with her. If you loved this episode or the podcast, leaving a quick rating or review helps more women find this space, and I appreciate it more than you know. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. You don't have to choose between the career and the life. You get to have both, and we're building that together. I'll see you next week. Vámonos.